Welcome, friends. Hello, welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. Hello, everybody who's watching on Facebook, all of you who are watching on our Zoom currently, and those of you who will be learning with us later. We are super happy to have you. My name is Eddie Chavez Calderon. I am the campaign director of Uri Tzedek. I enjoy to get to work with so many people on this beautiful panel that we've been able to bring together. So it makes me really excited to have so many wonderful leaders that I look up to in one space. So I'm going to go ahead and allow our panelists to introduce themselves. And this may be hard because a lot of them are really phenomenal speakers. So I'm going to ask the hard, challenging question to have our speakers introduce themselves in a minute or less. If we can go ahead and get started with that. So Rabbi Shmuley, if you don't mind introducing yourself, and then we'll move to Rabbi Rosenn and Mirele.
Shalom, shalom. It's great to be with everyone. Shmuley Yanklowitz from Uri Tzedek, Orthodox Social Justice Movement, he, him, his. And I'm so happy to be with all of you and to think about this important topic and to partner with two amazing Jewish leaders on this program.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Jennie Rosenn, the founder and CEO of Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action. So wonderful to be here with all of you. We have so many opportunities to partner, and it's great to have an opportunity to really talk together about climate justice. Dayenu is a national Jewish organization, and we're building a multi-generational movement of American Jews to confront the climate crisis, we like to say with spiritual audacity and bold political action. It's great to be here.
Hi, I'm Mirele Goldsmith. I'm the co-chair of Jewish Earth Alliance. We're a grassroots national network calling on Congress for climate action. I'm an environmental psychologist, and I focus on how we get people to actually take action, to go from thinking about it to changing what they do and speaking up for climate action. And it's a great pleasure to be here.
I love that. Thank you so much. See, as y'all can see, we have an incredible lineup today, my friends. So to start off our panel, I want to ask a question for each and every one of you on this panel. That question is, how does Judaism tie into your fight for climate justice? Whoever feels fit to go first, please go first.
Okay, I'll go first. I was thinking about what to say in answer to that question. It's a hard question because for me, everything is about being Jewish. You know, that's who I am. And whatever action I take in the world, whatever I work on, that comes out of being Jewish. But recently, I had a lovely conversation with my dad, Rabbi Emmanuel Goldsmith, who unfortunately at this point is suffering from some dementia. So it's really wonderful when he shares kind of his deep wisdom. And I think he was kind of trying to give me his last will and testament one day. And he said, Judaism is ethics wrapped up in beautiful traditions. And in answer to your question, I would say that the climate challenge, the climate crisis is the ethical challenge of our time. And we have to react to it as Jews. So I think I can leave it at there, and I'm sure we'll come back to this question many times in this conversation.
Yes.
Just to follow up on Mirele's beautiful kind of distillation of what it means, I too come to this through a Jewish lens and through the doorway really of Jewish social justice, because the climate crisis is a political issue, it's a justice issue, it's a social issue. It's also an issue of the soul. And I think that there's so many Jewish values that call us to this work, not only the traditional ones that we sometimes think of, like Shomrei Adama, protecting the earth, or Bal Tashchit, prohibiting waste, but also like Tirdof Tzedek, pursuing justice, and Bacharta B'chaim, this is about choosing life. And I think at the core, it's about living L'dor Vador. Will we continue generation to generation, which is such a fundamental Jewish principle. I think also that the way that we enter into this as a people who has faced existential crises before, over and over through history. And each time we have not just survived, but we've had to like reimagine a different future and build that future. And that's the moment that we're in now. And the last thing, I mean, there's so many ways to answer this question, Eddie. It's like such a big question. But I also think that Judaism, Jewish tradition, Torah can also ground us in this work, whether it's models of courageous leadership that we have in our history, both, you know, biblical and historic, whether it's concepts like lo b'shamayim hi, it's not in the heavens, like we can do this, whether it's, you know, commentaries about Noah and that, you know, he failed because he was too small in his own eyes and we have to know we can do big things. It's theological frameworks around Brit, around covenant. All of these are really deeply rooted in our Jewish tradition. And so we bring all of this to the fight for climate justice.
Wow, I'm so moved by what Dr. Goldsmith shared and Rabbi Rosenn shared, and feel like enough has been said right there. I'll just add a small snippet as well around, you know, I mean, I'm moved by the fact that the Torah doesn't start with Jews. It starts with Adam and Chava. It starts with humanity. It starts with even more than humanity, all of life. And Elie Wiesel famously said the goal of Judaism was never to make the world more Jewish, but make it more human. And to think about just that Judaism feels very parochial or very particular, but in fact, Judaism at its core, as I understand it, is so deeply universalistic. And that's why I think the deep spiritual wisdom in Judaism around our interconnectivity, that we are more than just political beings. And as Rabbi Rosenn said, we are souls. We're souls, and I really believe that this is a spiritual awakening that needs to occur, as the greatest one, as Dr. Goldsmith said, for us to awaken to this moment. And I think Judaism has just enormous resources helping us to wake up to say that there's nobody in charge but us. Like there's a deep responsibility. And at the core of Judaism is mitzvah, like you have an obligation, you have a responsibility to stand up.
Thank you. So in terms of obligation, oftentimes we get the question that folks don't have accessibility to the knowledge to be able to fight for climate justice. Mirele, how can we make climate justice more accessible for a larger, vaster communities, not just in the Jewish community, but outwards to be able to join?
I have an answer for that, but your question really just brought to mind something that I used to say when I first became a student. I got a PhD in environmental psychology. And I remember just how I already had a graduate degree and a good education, and I knew a lot about the environment, but I remember just how overwhelming it was. All those facts, all that science that I didn't know. The perfect example is the difference between ozone in the atmosphere and ozone on the ground. Ozone on the ground is bad, but ozone in the atmosphere is good. It took me years, to master some of this information. But the truth is you don't have to master it. And the real answer to your question is that seeing is believing. So go out and see with your own eyes, and you'll understand a lot more than if you just read it in books. I had a couple of examples that I wanted to mention. Some of you may remember Representative Bob Inglis from South Carolina. He actually lost his position because he admitted that he was a Republican conservative, and he admitted that he believed in climate change, and he lost his job in Congress. But he tells the story that he had the opportunity to go to Antarctica, and he talked with scientists and he saw the evidence. And you can just imagine how much more dramatic that would be today. But you don't have to go all the way to Antarctica. And in fact, to see climate change today, we see it in the newspaper every day. We see that, heat waves are in every single community. So that's easy to see. And actually climate injustice is even easier to see than climate change. Just open your eyes and you'll see it everywhere, right? I remember when I was living in New York, we took a group on an environmental justice tour of Harlem. And we saw, one of the most obvious things was the bus depots. All the bus depots in New York are in Harlem, in an African-American community, so that people there will suffer from the pollution and not other people. I think it's also really, really important to see the solutions for yourself, because otherwise we can feel pretty hopeless. One of the most inspiring things that I ever did was go to see the first offshore wind farm in the United States, which is called the Block Island Wind Farm, and it's off Rhode Island, and there are 5 wind turbines there. And I went on an interfaith mission to see the first offshore wind farm, and a rabbi stood with us on the deck of the boat, and he explained how in Hebrew, ruach is both breath and wind, and how the wind that gives us breath and life can also bring us clean, life-saving, renewable energy. And I will never forget that, because I saw for myself, we can have this.
Thank you so much. The feeling that the breath and wind as one just moves my heart, as I'm sure it moves everybody else on this call. Now to you, Rabbi Rosenn. I'm interested. How do you think we can discuss intersectionality of climate justice on an international level, to be able to have conversations not just nationally but globally as well? Because I know personally from my poster right there the great work that Dayenu has done to mobilize the national community, but I think that oftentimes we see that there's not talks about intersectionality.
So several big questions wrapped up in there: intersectionality, international, national movements. Climate knows no borders. You were just sharing your bumper sticker earlier. Knows no borders, and the climate crisis is obviously a global phenomenon, and it's a global phenomenon that has very real local impacts. And so we need to sort of hold both of these, right? To be thinking about it globally, but then what is our sphere of influence? How does it manifest locally, and how can we play a role locally? And I think, we're seeing the very real impacts. You spoke, Dr. Goldsmith, about the bus depots in my neighborhood where I live, and where I see, them in many, many poor communities in New York. And I happen to live in Harlem. That's why I said in my neighborhood. And the impacts that we see internationally are almost hard to fathom. We think about Pakistan. We think about large proportions of countries that are underwater already. The floods in Pakistan is just one example of thousands of major climate events that happen every single week, every single month, every single year. And I think these are like a cruel reminder of the most impacted communities are the least responsible. And that is sort of a basic tenet of what is happening. And we see this also in the United States, that Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color, poor communities, marginalized sort of geographic communities are the most impacted and the least contributing to the problem. I would say that the US has sort of an outsized role to play as the largest emitter, right? So we think about it, understand it globally, understand our role, and we have real leverage and power to pressure the US government to lower emissions, to provide financial support to developing countries, right? So there's like, what do we do here in the US? And then how do we act responsibly to developing countries? In addition to lowering emissions, we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground and unburned. And this is, as you both spoke about, a justice issue. It's about who's most impacted and who's least responsible. I want to say on the international front, our friends at American Jewish World Service are doing great work abroad. Dayenu's focus is really, as you said, national. And we mobilize through grassroots Dayenu circles and through partnerships with institutions, Jewish, secular, faith, other climate organizations. And this is really important that the Jewish community work in partnership with other organizations to mobilize campaigns. And those are policies like passing the Inflation Reduction Act, But it's also working on the part that happened with the Inflation Reduction Act, which were sort of these horrible trades that were made, associated often with Manchin, what's been named the dirty deal. How do we stand as allies to frontline communities to hold that off? And in addition to the policy work, there's also electoral work. How do we elect candidates who are climate champions? And how do we keep fossil fuels in the ground? So Dayanu's, as you mentioned, the national campaigns, I think your poster is from Hear the Call maybe, or from the Passover Actions. I can't see, it's very small in my Zoom screen.
Yes, correct.
But mobilizing public actions is one way of action. Dr. Goldsmith mentioned writing letters to Congress, right? These are all different tools in our toolkit. But the big picture is, this is a global issue. We have responsibility, and we as the Jewish community have a real role to play in confronting the climate crisis and bringing all of our people and power and spirit to the larger climate movement.
Thank you, both of you. Well,
can I add something?
Yes,
Before
please.
the moment passes, I wanted to pick up on something that Rabbi Rosenn said about our responsibility internationally and the huge inequity of the fact that the United States is responsible historically for the majority of emissions, and people in developing countries who really are living at a very low level with very little access to energy are paying the price. And I know this is something that's very overwhelming. And going back to your question about how can we learn, I forget exactly how you asked it, but how can this information become more accessible? I want to recommend to your listeners that if you don't want to read scientific tomes and you don't want to read the New York Times, try reading science fiction. I recommend reading The Ministry of the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, which opens with a scene, a description of a heat wave in India. And it's so realistic because, since he wrote it, we've actually seen it happen in India. But it will teach you, you will get the facts, you will get the information. He's a very, he's well steeped in the science, but it will give you the feeling of what climate change is doing to people in countries that are not as wealthy as ours.
Eddie, if I can just jump in on the sort of how can people learn question, because I think that often it feels so overwhelming because it's scientific and most people are not scientists, because it feels politically mired and charged, and because it's just so big to imagine, how we get our arms around this. And so I think too often people turn away or busy themselves in their lives or disassociate almost because it's like too much to take in. It's too much for our souls to bear, imagining what's happening and what our future could look like for our children and our grandchildren. And I think that one of the ways is to really find organizations that you trust, who are on the front lines. Often it's frontline communities who have the kind of most powerful solutions, organizations whose theories of change you stand behind, organizations whose campaigns you believe in, and to join them, to join your power to them, and to not feel like you have to understand and know everything. And that's how we build collective power and knowledge.
Thank you, both of you. I'm getting chills. And so this next question really stems from both of the conversations that we were having, and I think Dr. Goldsmith mentioned this a little bit, but oftentimes the climate justice conversation seems to be in the future and misses out on those directly impacted the most, which in this case are Black and Brown communities. Locally here in Phoenix, we've seen that a lot of the structures are based in Black and Brown communities that bring in the most pollution. Phoenix has one of the highest rates of asthma in the country based off of a lot of these environmental issues that are sprouted by not only climate change, but environmental racism. How can we work to bring an equitable system that highlights not only the conversation around the most folks who are directly impacted, but really bring them into the conversation as well? So this is going to be for Rabbi Rosenn and Dr. Goldsmith.
Okay. So first, I want to identify as I said before, that these communities, their identity isn't one of victimhood. Like, these communities have solutions. They have lived experiences, and many of them have technical expertise that they've had to develop because of the dire context. So part of our work is like codifying ways for them to be part of the process and building solutions. Policies, yes, that bring resources to those communities, but also including them in the decision-making, right? Ensuring that their needs and voices are centered as these policies are shaped. And we see this with the Inflation Reduction Act. How are those resources going to be dispersed, and who's going to be part of making that decision? Another way is, I think we can really stand as allies. How do we bring the Jewish community, our people in power, to the front lines? I know, Dr. Goldsmith, you've spent time at Line 3 in Minnesota, showing up in multi-faith delegations. Dayanu's work around the dirty deal, that side deal I was talking about, really working to hold off the Mountain Valley Pipeline, bringing the Jewish community's power to support those frontline groups that are leading. And I think, the core concern of the dirty deal is that it's trying to curtail environmental consultation and public participation. It's trying to hold out the communities that are most impacted. And so, what's exciting at this moment is I think there is a growing recognition of historic wrongs. Like, I think that's becoming more a part of the discourse. You look at like Justice 40 that calls for 40% of the resources to go to underserved communities, but it's not just going to happen. It's not like inevitable. That's really going to mean our standing together and continuing to advocate and letting these communities lead. I'll put in the chat in a moment, tomorrow there's actually a day of action being held by some of these frontline communities. Some of you may know Joey Braun, who was a leader of the Indigenous Environmental Network, who passed away very suddenly. And her daughter is calling for this day of action. And that's the way to, really show up. The last thing I'll just say is it's not just about like dropping in for a day of action. I think what's most important is building relationships and trust with organizations and leaders on the front line. And that takes time, and that takes humility, and that takes not leading, but really listening deeply, and showing up for local environmental justice groups. And that's something I know we've really been working with our Dayenu circles in different communities to be able to do effectively, not just to join national campaigns, but also to really work on the state and local level where a lot of this is playing out, where a lot of the decisions are being made, and to build those relationships that are so core to shaping these policies and ensuring that voices are at the table.
Well, I think you said it very well, Rabbi Rosenn. I'll just pick up on two of those things. One, the personal level. As Rabbi Rosenn said, it's about showing up, and it's about being there. I did have the privilege of going out to protest the Line 3 pipeline, which is now bringing tar sands oil from Canada to the Great Lakes. Unfortunately, we didn't succeed in stopping that one. But the reason that I went out there, and a delegation from Dayenu also participated, we had a nice showing of Jews there, I have to say, is that the local Native Americans, Anishinaabe, called for people to come there. And it was in northern Minnesota, and believe me, not that easy to get to, but thousands of people made the trip. And I will just say, from a personal perspective, I learned a tremendous amount there and got a lot of inspiration and encouragement and strength from being there. First of all, I learned a lot about how fossil fuel extraction is affecting people in that community, and what it really means when they're afraid of water pollution from this oil that's going to destroy the wild rice crop. And the wild rice is their culture. That's not only their subsistence food, but their whole culture is built around that. But also just to see all those people come together. One thing I told people so many times is, this wasn't the place where we all met was somewhere that has no infrastructure. It wasn't like having a protest in the middle of New York City or Washington, D.C. Everyone had to drive a long way to get there. And then the place where we all met had no parking. And there were hundreds of volunteers who came up from Minneapolis with their cars just to shuttle all the protesters around. And it's really, I mean, heartwarming doesn't really even convey the feeling that you have that all these people came out to help, to be there, to make it possible just for us to protest, and then to support the people there who were really fighting the fight. And then on a more policy level, as Rabbi Rosenn was talking about, what we do with Jewish Earth Alliance is that we try to mobilize Jews to speak to Congress, to take action on federal policy issues so that our voice is heard. You mentioned Justice 40, for example. That's a whole of government initiative of President Biden's administration for 40% of the benefits of investments in climate solutions to go to disadvantaged communities and historically marginalized communities. Well, that's going to require a lot of oversight. It's a great idea, but there are so many obstacles to those communities actually accessing those benefits and making sure the money gets to where it's supposed to go. So we need to stay in touch with our members of Congress and with the administration to make sure they know that, you know, we're with our allies in the environmental justice community to make sure that this actually happens. And that's what we do. And we have a lobby day coming up for Tu B'Shvat on February 6th. And we'll be meeting with legislators all across the country. It'll be on Zoom, virtual. So everyone can participate. And you don't need to know how to lobby, because every citizen has the right to speak and the responsibility that it's a mitzvah, like Shmuley said. It's a mitzvah to speak up. So, you know, that's just one way of actually making sure that this progress that we're seeing is actually going to come to fruition.
Thank you so much. And in this wonderful panel, I have to ask this question since we have the honor of having two rabbis on a panel. And we'll start with Rabbi Shmuley in the general question, moving as well to Rabbi Rosenn. What specific piece of Torah inspires you? And what Torah really calls to your heart to fight for climate justice?
Wow, thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm actually going to share my screen on that point. Can you see that?
It's loading.
Honestly, got it?
Yep.
Okay, well, the first bit of Torah that inspires me is just looking, a deep sense of hakara tatov, a deep sense of gratitude of this world we live in here, which is just so beautiful. And and the beauty awakens such a deep sense of responsibility and awe. And so in Musar, we call it yira, like how to live with yira, a sense of radical amazement, a sense of just deep gratitude. You know, I recently heard Jane Goodall speak, and she said, it's not that we've inherited this land from our parents as much as we've stolen it from our children. And this sense of radical amazement of just yira, of this amazing gift we've been given of air and water and land and plants and species, even though we're wiping them out, and just what that yira like does for us. And I think that's the first one. That's the first place I come from this at, is just a sense of gratitude and a sense of responsibility that emerges from that. You know, but there is one Rav Hirsch I want to share over here, because I don't think it's something we talk about as much in this work, and I think it's important. He says, 19th century German rabbi in his Torah commentary, do not destroy anything. So on this issue of Bal Tashchit, is the first and most general call of God. If you should now raise your hand to play a childish game, to indulge in senseless rage, wishing to destroy that which you should only use, wishing to exterminate that which you should only exploit, if you should regard the beings beneath you as objects without rights, not perceiving God who created them, and therefore desire that they feel the might of your presumptuous mood, instead of using them only as the means of wise human activity, then God's call proclaims to you, do not destroy anything, be a mensch. Only if you use the things around you for wise human purposes, sanctified by the word of my teaching, and only then are you a mensch and have the right over them, which I have given you as a human. However, if you destroy, if you ruin at that moment, you are not a human, but an animal. You have no right to the things around you. You know, I'm moved by this Rav Hirsch because I think it touches on Menschlichkeit. We often think about Menschlichkeit as being someone who uses nice words and holds the door for someone and is just kind of pleasant to be around. But Menschlichkeit for Rav Hirsch means thinking about our consumer habits, thinking about how we consume. And of course, going beyond thinking about our personal behavior to our communal behavior, to our institutional behavior, to our systemic, national, and global behavior. That is a new way to think of Menschlichkeit. Don't not just be nice, but be thoughtful of what you use and how you use it, and the political implications. The last thing, and on that point as well, and I must say, the Menschlichkeit of what we eat, because I really do believe at the center of an environmental movement needs to be a vegan movement, an anti-violence movement where we don't do violence to the earth, we don't do violence to animals. And that is not just a personal behavior, that is about combating big ag and the government subsidies they have and the lobbying power they have to do whatever they want in factory farming, where there's 80 billion land animals killed a year, not including the 50 to 160 billion fish, and the suffering that is involved with them, and the huge climate impact that emerges from that. And this is Menschlichkeit. This is not just liberalism. This is not just tree hugging. This is like the core of Menschlichkeit, as Rav Hirsch explained it. Last thing I'll say is just my understanding of halakha. I know there's a diverse group of Jews here and different ways to think of halakha, but halakha is a guiding force in my life. And I don't translate it as Jewish law, I translate it as progress. Halakha means walking forward. And it is spiritual practices that help us walk forward. And I believe that's the center of Torah. Going back to mitzvot, at least 611 of the 613 Torah mitzvot are actions. They're mitzvot. They're not believe this or think that, or be a Democrat, or be a Reformed Jew or an Orthodox Jew. It says, go do this stuff, right? And I think that's what halakha is about. It's about dreaming of a better world and every day doing things to help us get there.
Thank you, Rabbi Rosenn.
Goodness. Shmuley, I think you knew that question was coming.
Yeah.
So I mentioned before Lo Shamayim, which is from what we are told when we are wandering in the desert, not yet to the promised land. And God says to us, it is not in heaven, it's in your hands, in your heart, and you can do it. And I think about this a lot because I think that it is a sense of both obligation, it's on us, it's up to us, and it's on us, like we got this, we can do this. The reason we named Dayenu, most people think about it as the song that you sing at the Passover Seder. It would have been enough if God had taken us out of Israel and not given us the Torah. Dayenu, it would have been enough, out of Egypt, excuse me. But it also means we've had enough, like enough destruction, enough valuing fossil fuel companies over frontline community, enough, right? That urgency, that call. But it also means we have enough. We have what we need. We have the technology, we have the policies, we have the resources. We have what we need so that everyone can have enough. And I see that reflected in Lo Shamayim. I see that reflected in the call of Dayenu. And I see that reflected in what we as a Jewish climate movement need to hold, which is the urgency and the hope, the possibility, not to devolve into a sense of nihilism or despair, not to be kind of let off the hook, but we can do this, and there's an urgent call. I mentioned before the Kiddushat HaLevi, which is a more involved piece of Torah than I can go into right now, but it's a commentary on Noach, where they say, how could you call him a tzaddik? He did not stand up to God, right? It's not like Abraham. And Kiddushat HaLevi, the commentator, comes and says, he didn't stand up because he was too small in his own eyes. I find that very, very profound. We may say, I can't do this. It's too big. I am too small. Or we can really meet the moment. And meet the moment, and this is the next piece, with the kind of response that the climate crisis demands. We need to change our personal practices, for sure. We need to green our institutions and lower our communal carbon emissions, absolutely. But if we do that, Lo Dayenu, it's not enough. We also need to be addressing the systemic systems that are happening, or we will not avert the worst of climate disaster. We will not keep from that 2% that the 2 degrees that the scientists tell us we have to stay below. For that, we need to really be building collective power and addressing the kinds of things like policies, like who we elect, like how do we keep fossil fuels in the ground. And so that brings me back to the sense of we cannot be too small in our own eyes. Lo b'shamayim, we collectively can respond to this as a community together with other communities in all of our power.
I'm not a rabbi, but could I share some Torah too?
Yes, please.
I just really wanted to share that when I started learning about the sabbatical year, the Shemitah year, it really blew my mind. You know, one of my teachers, Jeremy Benstein, says that Judaism and environmentalism are both countercultural. And the vision that we have in the Torah of the sabbatical year is truly radical. And I think it also can really teach us about this, the sort of relationship between climate change and social justice in a way that, you know, I mean, anyone can understand it, right? We have to let the land rest. We have to take care of the land so that it can take care of us. But in order for that to happen, we have to take care of people. You know, the second mitzvah of the sabbatical year is to forgive the debts. And why do we have to forgive debts? Because if someone is in debt, you know, we're talking about an agricultural society in the time of the Torah. If someone's in debt, they're not going to be able to stop farming and let the land rest. So the close, relationship between the land, the caring for the land and caring for people is so clear in those mitzvahs about the sabbatical year. And the only way to get through the sabbatical year is together as a community. So to me, that is just the most powerful teaching that we have in Judaism that really talks about sustainability, you know, in a very, very profound way. And I think that anybody here who hasn't studied about the sabbatical year, I highly, highly recommend it, because there's a lot more to it than just what's in the Chumash, in the Torah. You have to really study the commentaries to really understand how profound and radical and life-changing that mitzvah could be.
Thank you so much. And this really moves me into thinking about now action and thinking about how can we start mobilizing a lot of our youth in the efforts of climate justice to move forward, not just our generations of activism, but the future generations of activism. So we can go with Rabbi Rosenn for this.
So just to state the obvious, there are many youth involved in climate advocacy and action, Jewish youth and youth of all backgrounds. And this is the world they've been born into. It is the issue most on their minds and hearts in a way that is really different for other generations, for whom it was a learning, an awakening, a coming into it. And so I think we need to understand the ways in which they already are leading. And we know that youth played a very significant role actually in getting us to the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a whole, you know, from Build Back Better, from the Green New Deal, from the sit-ins in the offices. They are leading us in many ways. And there are a lot of youth who also feel very upset, but not seeing a pathway forward for engagement. And so one of the things I know that we're doing is really growing our Dayenu circles on college campuses and training students to work together with partners and join campaigns like Hear the Call to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, or the Passover actions that we had outside of banks and asset managers' offices, many of them led by young people, calling on the banks and asset managers to stop funding fossil fuel. And then most recently, Chutzpah 2020, the Get Out the Climate Vote. And we work very closely with JYCM that has a growing number of high school groups. And part of this is also training them, empowering them, giving them skills. We're running actually, we do what we call Taking Down Goliath training, which is a 3-part training for young people, which we say are 18 to 32, to train them in Jewish climate organizing so they can organize and mobilize their peers to take action. We've trained hundreds in this, and we have registration. I'll put it in the link, because right now registration's open for one starting in a few weeks. So I would invite you, if you're interested, or if you have young adults in your life, to share it. Young people are inheriting the planet and the climate, and social movements show that they have been led in many times by young people. And I think that we really, I don't know even how to say this. I feel like we have an obligation to ensure that they have the resources they know, that we can really train up young Jews in strategy for building social movements. Taking Down Goliath is also about like the theory and practice of creating campaigns. Eddie, you said you're a director of campaigns. What does it take to really build a campaign? How do you make plans for ongoing organizing on your campus? How do you, start a Dayenu circle or some other form? And how do you work in partnership with the frontline communities that we've been talking about? And one of the pieces, and I'll just end with this, it loops back to before, is how do we weave climate Torah through all of this? And so we're very cognizant in all of our training of really weaving climate Torah through, because part of what we need is also to do this in community. You mentioned this, Dr. Goldsmith. It is so critical to how we build power, but also how we sustain ourselves in the face of this. And I think that is, we talk about an epidemic of loneliness. The pandemic has certainly increased isolation. I think we talk about a crisis of mental health among young people. And so I think providing spaces and trainings and supportive communities in the Jewish community for young people to really take meaningful action together.
Thank you so much. And right before we move into questions, I want to finish off our last question for each of the panelists. Oftentimes we get so energized and so ready to go after hearing phenomenal presentations, but it leads to the final question. Well, what do we do now? What are some tangible things that the community can do right now that can make an impact in the fight for climate justice?
I can jump in.
Go for it.
So the first thing I would say is decide right now, before you log off on whatever platform you're watching this on, decide that you're going to do something to address the climate crisis on a systemic level. You're going to continue to do the practices that you do, but you're also going to find a way to join a campaign, organization, or a community that's starting to address the climate crisis at the scale that science and justice demand that we do. So the first thing I would say is just make a decision that you're going to do that. And then, to offer you a few ways that you can do that, get to know your local frontline environmental justice groups right in your community. We talked about that at the beginning of this conversation. I would be remiss in doing my job if I didn't say, if you're not already on the Dayenu list, join us so you can receive ongoing opportunities to take action. I mentioned a few of the campaigns. Right now, we just launched All Our Might, B'chol Ma'odecha, a campaign to end the era of fossil fuel and enter into an era of clean energy future. Join us in that work. There's actually a call tonight, which I can also put in, for folks who want their synagogue or their local community to begin to move its money out of fossil fuel and into clean energy. Come, even if you just want to learn, no commitment. And finally, I would say, see if there is a Dayenu circle in your area or a Jewish Earth Alliance group in your area, something that you can join. And if there isn't one, consider starting one. It's so powerful to take action in Jewish community. And it's also a really powerful way to become part of the larger Jewish climate movement, and in turn become part of the larger national climate movement, which, to take us back to the beginning, is how we contribute to what is a global crisis, and do that as Jews in community.
Great, I love that. I'm going to jump in before Dr. Goldsmith here. So first thing I would say is figure out your pathway to going vegan. Going vegan feels really crucial, and embrace Shamayim Synagogue Vegan Challenge. Shamayim will give grants to synagogues that start offering reducing their dairy and reducing their meat and offering vegan options with vegan education. But here's my big suggestion, and you might think it's coming out of left field, but explore the theology of reincarnation. Reincarnation. We should believe in reincarnation. Why should we believe in reincarnation? Because I think for those of us who think we're not going to be here in the future, it's very easy to look past it. One of the reasons that younger people care more is because it's going to impact them. And older people care less is because they're like, that's after my life, right? Other people are going to worry about it. I don't like to think of all people as being selfish, but I think people do think about self-interest. And younger people understand the implications of climate change are going to happen in their lifetimes in ways people in their 70s or 80s don't feel the same way. And so a theology of reincarnation says, it's not somebody else who's going to have to deal with this. It's me. I'm going to be here. It's self-interest, right? Altruism is not enough to shift behavioral change. We need to understand it's going to be ourselves as well. Self-interest is involved here. And so I think the theology of reincarnation feels really important for us to really, really understand what's at stake right now. So lots more to say, but I'll pass it to Dr. Goldsmith.
Okay, with the two of you talking, all I could do was think of more things that I wanted to add. So first of all, what Rabbi Rosenn said is the most important thing of all. Join a group. No one can do this on their own. No one can learn all of this on their own. No one can sustain the energy on their own. Get involved with some kind of group, find like-minded people, and that's the most important thing that you can do. And it might take a little while to find the group where you feel comfortable, so don't give up. Just, keep trying. And of course, you're welcome to join Jewish Earth Alliance as well. But there are many groups, local groups. It doesn't even have to be a Jewish group. Just find some group. This is not for everyone, I have to say, but I personally love going to protests. When you go to a protest, you're surrounded by other people who care as much as you do. All of them made the time to go out and do something. This morning, I went to the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission office, which is near Union Station in downtown Washington, D.C., where I live. And a small group of us were protesting the fact that FERC is approving every fossil fuel energy project that comes before it and not doing enough for renewable energy. And first of all, I met some wonderful environmental justice activists from Port Arthur, Texas, who are fighting liquid natural gas projects in their area. I learned from them. I found new allies in the environmental justice community. And then someone said to me, we need someone to go into the meeting and stand up and disrupt the meeting. Now, I am telling you this not because I think you all have to do civil disobedience, but because I want to share that I never did this before. I have been an environmental activist for over 20 years, and I never disrupted a public meeting. But I was at this protest, and they said everyone who disrupts the meeting gets on a list, and they can never go into the meeting again. So we really need new people. We can't do it alone. We need someone new to go into the meeting. So I took a deep breath and I said, yeah, I can do this. They promised me I would not get arrested. I went into the meeting. Someone else did it before me. And after the clerk finished explaining that although this was a public meeting, the public was not allowed to speak, I was really shocked. It's a public meeting, but the public is not allowed to speak. I stood up and I said, stop, FERC, and we need renewable energy or something to that effect. And I was hustled out of there by the police. You will find reserves in yourself if you get involved. You will find yourself doing things you never expected to do with the support of the people around you. And I cannot tell you how good that feels, because instead of just despairing about the state of the world, you'll be taking action. You'll be doing something about it. And if enough of us do that, we will change the world.
Love that. Eddie, before you go to questions, I just want to say one last thing about religious pluralism. I'm going to share my screen on this article I just saw. Many here, I'm sure, like myself, have been troubled about Israel's new government coalition. And although there's been an interesting development over the last day with the Supreme Court and dairy, I don't want to get too far afield here for what we're dealing with, but you might have seen this. Israel's new right-wing leaders immediately made plastic plates inexpensive again. Why? For the ultra-Orthodox population, okay? So there's a lack of understanding there. It's a whole different phenomenon when we talk about Orthodoxy in Israel and Orthodoxy in America and around this. But we can learn from everyone, not that they're doing this for the same reasons we might, but look at this paragraph here. Haredim are actually more green than anyone else, this person interviewed says. We buy less clothes, we don't fly abroad, and our communities really rely heavily on gamachim and passing things on, he said, referring to the free loan establishments that provide anything from baby bottles to evening gowns. So I think that one of the things that our Jewish movements can do as well, embrace religious pluralism to see how are some communities in the Jewish world doing things really well we can learn from, and how are others doing some things as well. And I think there's so many facets to this that we can learn from each other.
Thank you, friends. We're going to go ahead and open it up to questions. I see, Richard, you had a question waiting.
Right. Okay, thanks. First of all, Kohak about everybody. Wonderful, great presentations. Now, as Rav Shmuley said, it's always so eloquently, we need to move toward a vegan world. But recent reports indicate that by the middle of this century, meat production may actually double. And because of this, used to be 6 trillion trees, is now 3 trillion. And vast areas, if they were reforested to sequester some of that atmospheric carbon dioxide, which is now way over 350 parts per million, I'll finish in a minute, that the experts think is a...
Sorry to pause you, Richard, but we can't hear you. I'm having issues hearing you. Is there any way you can get a little louder? Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to get closer to the screen at least. So the question is, how do we get people to realize that unless there's a major shift toward plant-based diets, there's no way we're going to avert a climate catastrophe?
Why don't we take thank you. Why don't we take all questions now, and then all panelists can take a final remarks, if that's okay.
Yeah, that works. Aglaya?
Okay, hi. One of the things that concerns me, though, is that when I was a grad student, this is an example, when I was a grad student at Tulane, I had friends at the law school who started off wanting to do environmental law, and then the just enormity of the issue just came at them. And then all they wanted to do was quit or sit and cry and everything, though. One of the worst cases I've heard, I put a movie in the chat box. It's called My Louisiana Love that I used for one of my classes. And I was, warning about that. That one actually also deals with the woman who's an activist, her boyfriend, her fiance was an activist, and then he committed suicide. So what my concern is, though, is that activism is an emotional commitment also. How can we meet the needs of these activists? So, because if we don't have them, because it's just too, it becomes overwhelming, then yeah, we're not going to be able to do anything.
I'd love to speak to that, Eddie, if I may.
If anybody else has a question, please ask it now. Before we move on. If not, we can go ahead and start answering.
Great. So maybe we all just take a closing minute or two to respond as we wish. Does that work?
Yeah. Great. Go ahead, Rabbi Rosenn.
It's such a powerful question and a painful question. And it sounds like this film, which I want to check out, is a particularly powerful reflection of that pain that can come from addressing the climate crisis and really taking it in, right? If you really take it in, it's almost too much to hold. And as I said, it's an issue of the soul. And I think that means a few things. I think that we need to make spaces where people can share that and articulate that. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Joanna Macy and the work that reconnects. Dainu has been developing a sort of Jewish adaptation of that. We call it spiritual adaptation. In climate, you talk about mitigation and adaptation. And so the question is, how do we also spiritually adapt? And part of the workshop is to really make space for people to share the anxiety and the grief, for some people, the guilt, some people, the anger, and then to begin to move into active hope and ultimately courageous action. For our workshops, it's in a Jewish context, but it can be done in all sorts of contexts. And I've actually seen secular climate organizations start to integrate more of this into their work, which I think is a reflection of that. I think that in the Jewish community, climate Torah is part of that. How do we tap into courageous leaders and times of just despair and catastrophe and threat that we have in our own history? How do we tap in with our ancestors? And I think that music and arts is actually a really powerful piece as well. We've been developing new Jewish climate music and are now exploring some other new Jewish climate arts that really help to both strengthen the work, but also really sustain us in this work, because this is lifelong work. And it's lifelong work in a context that can sometimes just feel so hard. And the last thing I'll just say is I think it's so important for activists of all kinds, but particularly in the climate movement, to figure out what feeds your neshama, what feeds your soul. Is it prayer? Is it being with people you love? Is it, reading? Is it being connected to the earth and spending time, outside of urban areas and making time for that, feeling like, yes, this is urgent, this is existential, we need to give this everything we've got, but we also need to sustain ourselves for the long road ahead. And as we've talked about, a lot on this, in this conversation, community, so important to find community, neighbors, friends, family. Don't do this alone.
Thank you. We'll move with Dr. Goldsmith.
Well, I think Rabbi Rosenn said it all. I'm a big fan of Joanna Macy's work. I've participated in one of those workshops of the work that reconnects, facilitated by Rabbi Mordechai Liebling, and I found it extremely helpful. So I don't know how to say your name, Aglaia. I really recommend you do it if you haven't yet.
Very good. That's very good.
If you haven't yet, you should definitely sign up. There was one exercise that we did that I personally found very helpful, which we had to pair up, and one person had to be someone in this generation and the other one had to be someone in a generation 200 years from now, and we had to talk to each other. And I quickly said, I want to be the one from this generation. I didn't want to be the one from 200 years forward complaining, And I thought to myself, if I were going to talk to someone from 200 years hence, what would I want to say to them? And what I wanted to say was, I did everything I could. And that was just very, very, very helpful and healing for me. And I think that's the message of Joanna Macy, that, we have to do what we can. And as long as we're doing something, with the caveat, we got to take care of ourselves, but with the doing something, then we can have hope. And I also think it's a very Jewish message, because what is Judaism all about, if not the future? That thing that we can overcome any challenge, and we can survive it, and we can look toward a better future and building a better future. I can't help myself. I do want to give you another recommendation, which is to sign up for Yes Magazine. If you don't get that yet, Yes Magazine is a magazine that delves into the systemic issues facing our society, but emphasizes the people out there who are finding solutions and making them a reality. And it's a really good pick-me-up every month to read Yes Magazine.
Beautiful. I want to second and third what Rabbi Rosenn said and what Dr. Goldsmith said, and I see we're at time, so I'll just be super brief to say, just give us the bracha that we continue to hold the light and the dark together, both the hope and the despair, and that we make this a joyful movement, as serious as it is, a joyful movement of eating joyfully together, of praying together, of marching together, of advocating together in a way that sustains us and sustains all life around us.
Amen.
Amen.
Everybody have a phenomenal day. The steering wheel is now in your hands. Where you drive is up to you now. where you walk, let's say where you walk is now up to you. Friends, thank you so much. Make sure you follow Urilet Tzedek. Make sure you go to utzedek.org to find a growing list of learning libraries where you can find more information on our great friends from Dayenu, our great friends from Jewish Earth Alliance, and find out more of how you can get involved. Everybody, take care. Bye-bye.